All right. So one of the things I realized is, in the world I live in as a police chaplain, it's a world of kind of constant conflict. And one of the struggles I have sometimes in the church is that there's a lot of people that really struggle with preparing for and functioning well in conflict. We live in a society that doesn't allow us to kind of experience and to learn. We're going to talk about, from kind of that police, taking that police culture, taking it out and going, how do we kind of prepare for conflict so that we respond correctly, respond the right way, and learn how to do that, and also kind of embrace it. And I thought, I was doing this it's like there's this thing in me that I really want to call out warriors in men. And I think in life that there's been times where I felt in churches, I felt very alone. And I was talking to somebody earlier about, guys in their church don't want to engage in conflict, and he felt very alone. And what's interesting is then I entered into a culture where I'm a police chaplain among a bunch of warriors. There's friends of mine that are special forces guys that have left the military and now are police officers. And when I do this presentation, I always tell them, I feel a little odd talking about being a warrior and preparing for conflict because I experience it, but not to the level that some of my friends do, and knowing that they have experienced at such a higher level. And so I go by a lot of things what they say, but I want you guys to do something here. This is a video that shows a dash cam, and the guy that's in this video is a Oregon State Trooper named Matt Zistel. And this is an incident that occurred a few years ago on I-84, and I want you to do two things. I want you to kind of think as if you were a police officer. And so police officers go through their day and they talk about it's just like, for instance, and so, as a police officer, they do traffic stops. And so if you ever heard what police officer, we batteries going on, or just kind of phasing here. So when police officers do a traffic stop, they have a statement that they make about the traffic stop. They talk about going up to the car and being as courteous as possible and having an alternate plan to kill everybody inside there if they need to. And that's that conflicted world that they live in. They have these two things that are happening kind of simultaneously that are really hard for people to understand. So this video is a dash cam from Matt's car, and he spent his morning doing about a dozen traffic stops. I talked to him about this. He did about 12 traffic stops before this. So he's always doing traffic stops. So first thing, when an officer pulls over to do a traffic stop, what's the first thing the officer does? Do you know? So first thing before.
You know what you were doing?
What?
You know what you were doing?
So he says that when he comes up to the car. So before he even gets out of his car, what does an officer say? He gets on the radio and says,
tell him where I'm at.
I'm going to tell you where I'm at. Why does he say where he's at?
In case he needs backup.
In case he needs backup, and even worse, he needs backup and he can't talk. Because that's happened a number of times. Officers go out to a call and they actually radio to the officer that the car was stolen, and the guy was waiting for him in the car with a pistol, shot the officer, the Vancouver motor officer, in the face. And they're trying to call him. And they're trying to call him and they can't get a hold of him. And the only way they know where he is his previous call of saying where the traffic stop started. So I want you to do some things. I want you to, in this process, I want you to start thinking about action as both a physical, emotional, spiritual, and an entire body process. So I want you to do something. So on this traffic stop, as it starts rolling, I want you to first think when you would have your gun out. Because there's kind of this thing as a police officer, you're carrying all these weapons, you're carrying all this stuff. And so you're trying to think through levels of escalation that are appropriate. So they'll have these charts that officers have, and they're sometimes kind of goofy with all these different levels. So if this threat is this, then you do this. And you always want to have the upper hand. You always want to have control in these situations. So when you would take your gun out, I want you to stand up, and you might need to move so you don't block the screen. That happened earlier, and everybody stood up and it went blank. So if you hit the button one more time. Oh, different video. Go ahead. Let's go. Just, you don't have to stand up.
Holding company, household performance, status and balance, expired, transport public health, temporary state of status and balance, expired, to strict correction.
So they have subtitles. Sometimes hard to understand. And it's
15, 2016, 29 class.
this is from camera on his glasses, so it's going to be moving around. So if you get motion sickness and going to throw up, please don't.
Dispatch number 71023. What are you doing, man?
That's free over there.
Well, what is he doing again?
He tried to snatch that man bottle of liquor, but the man jumped in the car with trying to find back down.
Okay, I see him.
So as you probably noticed, this is a totally different video than I set up. I played an older version earlier today, and I was like, oh, it's Matt Vista one on it. So this is in South Carolina. This happened pretty recently. So there's the suspect. He's ID'd him. He's pulling up behind him here.
Dispatch, Echo 7. I'll be out with that subject. Come here, man. Come here for a second. Come here. If you don't, you better stop, or I would. Come here. Come here. Stop. I'm not. Stop. Stop. Take your hands out your pocket. Take your hands out your pocket. If you don't stop, so I'm gonna tase you. I'm not playing with you. Take your hands out your pocket. Take your hands out your pocket. Take your hands out your pocket. Shots fired! Shots fired! I'm texting it. Dispatch. Help.
Yeah, units dispatch, or any available units dispatch, respond. Top station, top station. Fire, gunshot fire, subject, head on north, the officer, suspect.
Dispatch, Echo 7, I'm hit. I'm hit. I'm hit in my neck someplace. My arms are broken. Help me, please.
All units 10-3, all units 10-3. Units 1033, 1033 at the South Station in Elko. Officer has been shot. He 1033, South Station in Elko. Officer shot. Yes, I'm taking it around to notify hotel people, please. Dispatch. Dispatch 011-17.
Go ahead, dispatch.
And is everything civil?
Dispatch, I'm hurt pretty bad.
Oh, we got help on the way. The subject still there?
Subject took off. Please help me, dispatch. My left arm is broken. I've been shot in the neck.
D2, I'm close to him. What am I going to?
Gunshot wound, officer down at the party shop next to the South Station. He has been shot. Possibly in the neck.
1040, suspect is Richard.
No, man. I've called 911. I'm saying, is there anything I can do for you? I don't know much about, I don't know much about, any kind of,
Which is good. Because if there's blood pouring out, you don't want to do CPR.
Dispatch, Echo 7, please help.
And he's still conscious?
Yeah.
Yeah, I seen you after that, boy. I seen you after. Okay, thank you, sir.
You can hit the button. So this goes on, and it goes 6 minutes before people come to help him from his department. And this is one of those instances you watch this. So at what point would you have your gun out?
As soon as he fails to listen.
Fails to listen. What else?
Failed to respond.
Failed to respond. So there's some things that this guy does, and these are things that officers are looking for. When you're going into conflict, you have to key in on certain things. You can't take in everything at the same. So you're keying in on what? What are you keying in on?
Hands.
His hands. What are the hands doing? What were his hands doing? Hand was in his pocket. Hand was in his pocket, and he would not take it out. So I'm not going to go into tactics in this thing. It's like I watch this and I'm just willing him, to wait for backup. Just stop. It's on police1.com, and it's going to end bad because it's a training video, and it's like, stop, don't. But it's one of those things. He goes into conflict. He goes in that situation, and he gets shot. And he says what to dispatch? How is he shot? Did you get shot?
The neck.
The neck. He's bleeding pretty bad from the neck.
Broken arm.
His arms are broken. He says. You can see his hand when he reaches for the radio. His hand's all bloody. He's doing that, and then somebody comes up and helps him. Who was that guy? Bystander. You can see him earlier on, and it went to. You hit play, and there's a play button up top that just goes to the slideshow. Run like there we go. So bystander is off to the side, kind of as he approaches this guy, and you can kind of see him off in the distance, off to the right, and he sees this thing happen, and he enters into this, and that's one of those things, man. Sometimes when you enter into conflict, I think it's not as clean as you think it would be. You see an officer go on, you go, okay, he's got it handled, he's got it taken care of, and all of a sudden, very quickly, that officer's in trouble, and you can hear this squawking noise. Wah, wah, wah. You know what that noise is? So you're trying to radio out, and when the air is busy, it squawks you. So he's kind of in a state of shock, and you can hear him going, and dispatch, help me. And he's kind of struggling to maintain composure, and up walks this guy, and just like I don't know anything about CPR, and I'm thinking, thank goodness, but he's there, and he says to him, I'm going to stay with you. And so that's one of those things. You look at that, it's like warrior takes on all different aspects. So we're going to look at next slide. I don't know if it's going to play that video again. Yes.
Wouldn't that officer be a little
Keep going. What?
Wouldn't that officer be a little bit nervous because he doesn't know who that bystander is?
Can you go to the top? It might have started at the middle. I'm sorry, I got distracted.
That's fine. If I was that officer, I'd be a little nervous about that bystander because I don't know who he is. He might be in the same gang.
Yeah. Can you go to the top of that? Technical difficulties.
Let's just do this. There we go. Oh, like that. Yeah. That's what you call.
Alright. Hit play. Alright. So we are back live. I'm going to pull this thing and turn it on. So actually talking. So when I watch this situation, I think about a lot of elements. Can you go to the next slide? Let's skip this one. So this is the Matt Zistel video that I was going to show you. And we started at the end with the other one. So this is the one on side of I-84. Go to the next one. Click it twice. Okay, I want to talk to you guys about something that's kind of become part of my life, and that is I have 5 boys. And I think about one of the things that God gave to me a long time ago is I want to raise up warriors, and I thought it was in ministry. And I was a youth pastor, and I went through a divorce. And after my divorce, I lost my heart to be in full-time ministry and just struggled. What does God want me to do? And so God put me in this culture as a chaplain in the midst of these warriors that make me want to stand a little higher. I've done funerals for Green Berets that served behind enemy lines in Vietnam. And one of those funerals, they invited me down for the last toast. And I was feeling like I'm $100, I'm feeling like I'm something big. And one of the Green Berets comes up to me and goes, they do a last toast of scotch for the Green Berets, this tradition. And he leans over and goes, Chaplain, just so you know, it's real scotch. I'm like, gosh, man, I'm not 12, I'm a chaplain, I'm not 12. It was like, again, it's like, But these are guys, like, I stand a little taller. These are people who have spent their life being brave and being warriors. And so I started looking from the context of my experience. I spent about 30 hours in cars with Portland police officers. I was with Portland, going to breakfast with Portland East sergeants, and the call came out of students hearing shots fired at Reynolds and smelling smoke in the gym area. And we drove there as fast as we could, and we were outside the door, and officers were going in the school with shots still going. I'm standing outside as a chaplain, directing students across the street to the Mormon church there, and I'm in the middle of this whole thing, and so I get caught up in these situations and had to kind of struggle through with learning how to live in that culture. I started as a police chaplain, and I could do things like funerals and weddings. That was something I could do, but going to all these scenes and being part of these situations as a chaplain, I started having nightmares. And in my nightmares, my gun would stop working, or I'd pull the trigger and the bullets would fall out the end. And so one day I asked an officer, so what do you do about that? And they go, you need to go train. You go shoot. That's how you get rid of those nightmares. And sure enough, I go to the range, I get a jam, I clear it, and keep firing. And it was about mental health. I'm not allowed to carry a gun as a police chaplain in Portland. But those are things that were part of that whole process of me going through. And I started looking at the life of David. Next slide, please. So what do we know about David? What's a really famous statement that God makes about David? What is that?
He was a man after my own heart.
He's a man after my own heart. And it's interesting. Because there's some things about David that kind of, I think, we struggle with. But for some reason, God didn't struggle with them the same way we did. And there's something unique, I think, that we need to take from this, that warrior is a job that you're called to that forces you to fail. When I'm sitting with young officers, and they're all excited, and they're going to save the world, and they're going to change everything, and I ask them, what are you going to do when you fail? And they go, oh, no, I'm prepared. I'm studied up. I'm good. I'm do everything. I am not going to fail. I'm going to not fail. And I go, this is a job that will make you fail. There are certain things you go into that will force you to fail. And as I looked at the life of David, I think that's one of the things. So next one, please. So there's a statement that God makes about David. He says, the man after my own heart. And he says this, he will do everything I want him to do. Did David do everything that God wanted him to do? Those are those statements I go, I don't know. I don't know what God is really talking about. I think it has to do with the person who David was and who God saw him to be. And knowing that when God's characteristics are reflected in mankind, they're always reflected in a flawed way. That we reflect the characteristics of God's being at peace, God being a God of love, God being a God of justice, kind of that warrior sense. But we reflect those imperfectly. And so I think when we enter into those things, we're called into this impossible thing. I think ultimately because God wants us to need Him. God wants us in relationship with Him, and God wants to do this. But we're going to look at the life of David. So next one. David and Goliath. Famous story. You've heard it before a bunch of times. Can you go to the next one? So we want to talk about a part of this story that I think that we miss when we read this. So how did David get prepared to meet Goliath? What did it say? So David says what? This is how I'm ready to meet Goliath. He says what? Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from his mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. So here's a thing that I think we mess up about that passage. But what I understand about training for conflict and friends of mine that hunt, I have a friend of mine that hunts mountain lion, and he calls them. And so he's sitting sometimes in cold places, and you're sitting there, and he's using an electronic caller trying to get a mountain lion. And there'll be times when the mountain lion comes in 10, 15 feet to the side of him and comes just crawling in. He can't hear it, and he'll just see a little movement and go, whoa, there it is. And you have this huge rush of adrenaline. If you're a hunter and you go out and you're facing a situation like that. So one of the things I think we miss is, how many times do you think it took David before he killed the lion and the bear? How many times? It doesn't say. I'm totally reading in this. I'll admit that. But from my understanding, how many?
A lot.
I really think it happened. He was out there watching the sheep. I think the first couple times he went, I think the mountain lion came running. The lion came in, grabbed a sheep and ran, and he went, oops, Dad's going to not be happy about that. I better do something about that. And then he started training, and maybe the next time he went after it. And he did things. I think it was a process for David, because understanding what I know about human physiology, you know what a visceral response is. You know what a visceral response is. So when you have a response to a traumatic or high-intensity conflict incident, you have a huge surge of adrenaline, and then you do what? Complicated math problems?
Fight or flight.
Tell your wife you love her and tell her great things about her. What do? What happens? You said fight or flight. Fight, flight, kill, or freeze. I mean, those are things that happen, and you react how?
How you're trained.
How you are trained. So I tell the story. I was a youth pastor, and we're doing this cleaning project for some of the older women in the church, some of the widows, and we're going out, and we had this woman who had about 2 feet deep of leaves in her backyard. And I'm raking through these leaves, and I see this hole in the ground. And I'm looking at that hole going, why is there a hole in the middle of this leaf pile? And then yellow jackets come out the hole, and I have yellow jackets in my ear, down my pants, in my shirt. So I'm there as a responsible adult with a bunch of high schoolers that are working as part of this day. So in my mind, I was yelling, run everybody bees. But somehow it came out as boo 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 boo. And I'm just running around, and everybody just stood there until they started getting stung too. And then everybody went afterwards, how come you didn't say it? I went, I did. That's that visceral response. It's that response that we have very little control over, other than as we train and predict and have the ability to have situations. So when you enter into a situation, when David was in training, I think that this was a process. I think there's things in this story that tell me this was a process, that he didn't wake up and go, I'm going to be brave, because there's physiologically things that take place when you respond to situations. I think God can work miracles. I think the normal thing that happens that I've seen in my life is that God uses our own physiology and trains us to do things. So I think when David first got confronted with the bear, he probably was really scared. The second time he said, I'm going to do something about this. And I don't know how many times it was before he did it, but he got to that point. Because when I started as a police chaplain, we would run code to a simple call, and I'd be sitting at the call. You know, all this adrenaline rushing through my system, and my body wasn't used to it. Now I've been at shootings, and I go home and go right to sleep. Same adrenaline's there, my body has just become accustomed to it. And it changes over time. I have officers that will tell me stories of how they have high blood pressure, hypertension, all these things going on. They're in perfect shape. They work out all the time. They eat really well. And then they retire, and they go back to their doctor, and the doctor says, all your symptoms have cleared up. That's what that adrenaline in your system can do. But your body becomes acclimated to it over time, and you can survive in these incidents without having this huge response. So I think when David confronted Goliath, we go through the situation. So David goes there and he sees Goliath making a mockery of the armies of God. And David decides he wants to do something about it. So David, one of the things we forget is David was a known commodity at this time. David would travel down to minister to Saul when Saul would have a bout with the evil spirit. He would go down there and he would play his harp, and probably not Stairway to Heaven, but anyway. He would play his harp and soothe Saul, and Saul would feel better, and he would go back and forth. So this time he came down to check on his brothers who were in the military. And he goes down there and he sees Goliath. And there's something really interesting that takes place. So David goes out to fight him. And David has trained, so David doesn't go pick up the things that he hasn't trained with. So one of the things we need to understand, when we go into conflict, when you go into a situation, you act as you have in your training. When you're in a fight or flight brain, you are not processing things. You are not able to cognitively reason and understand things. You react according to how you plan for it. So you get to that situation in conflict, and what happens is you fail. So the video I didn't show you of Matt Zistel. So Matt gets on the air after he's been shot. The suspect gets out of a car, shoots at him. He shoots the suspect. The suspect ends up dying. Matt gets on the air and goes, "Shot fired, shot fired." And then you hear him go to the back of his car, because he told me. He goes to the back of his car and does his battle breathing, gets his blood out of his fight or flight brain so he can think. And he goes, "I've been shot, I'm okay." Suspect information, this, and very calmly says that. And so, do you know why he calms himself down like that?
He's trained to give the appropriate information.
That would be a good reason. It's not the reason. And it's one of those funny things. So this is kind of an inside police culture thing. So one of the things about police culture is after you've been through a really traumatic event, everybody asks, "How did I sound on the radio?" And it's really funny. You go, "Oh, you sounded great. You were calm. You were great on the radio." So Matt gets out of his car and he screams this, and then he goes, "Oh, thank goodness, my radio's off." And it just transmitted to his dash cam, so it's on the video. So then he goes to the back of the car and clicks on his radio. Because there's a weird, in that warrior culture, if you are in a shooting and you get shot through your side and you live from that, they will still make fun of you if you sounded like a scared little child on the radio. And that's that thing, and there's a lot. I find a lot of glory in that, because it's like you kind of laugh about these things that happen and you can't control them. And so David goes to fight Goliath, and he knows what he's trained for. He grabs his sling, he grabs the stones, and someone said earlier about, there's different stories about whether Goliath had different brothers. I'm not sure. I've heard that story before too. So David grabs these stones and goes out to battle. So in this battle, there's some things that happen. Next one, please. So David was prepared. He had gone through training. He was tested and found deficient. I know that just from experience. That's how you get better. Because you don't know. Because the bottom line, officers in the deepest, darkest part of their mind, one of the fears they have is, how am I going to respond when I'm in a shooting? Because you don't know. You don't know until it happens. And you hope you do well. You hope you respond well. So you train for that moment. You have this process you go through. But there's times that there's been friends of mine that have had shootings happen right in front of them and they didn't get their gun out. And that just eats at them. Which is just is hard for them to take. That they didn't get their gun out and this guy was trying to kill their friend. And they didn't respond. Wow. So you go through these situations and you have opportunity to fail. And that is the only way you really can learn. I really believe that. And I think that has to do with, too, ultimately, I think that is how God is at work in David's life. David is put into position to fail until he succeeds. So then he's confronted with Goliath. Next slide, please. So the Philistine, with his shield beared in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So why is that significant that David was a good-looking young man? Do you know? Do you know? So what was warfare like back then? Yeah. I'll tell you this. If I had police officers, and I'll show you this in a second, if you had slides of police officers' x-rays, which I'll show you in a second, there's pins, there's bones. I had my shoulder rotator cuff done this year twice. I loved it so much I tore it and retore it and did it again this summer. But I've entered into a club. Most police officers are either like pre-shoulder rotator cuff or after shoulder rotator cuff. That's just a common thing. It's just this constant tear on their body. So when David comes forward, this is a different time period too medically. So when you had hacks and cuts taken out on your face, they didn't nicely stitch it together to make you still be a teen model. You looked pretty horrific. And so he sees David and he goes, this is no warrior. He is no match for me. He knows how people respond in combat, in conflict. And he thinks this is somebody who's not prepared, but he's wrong. And it says this, I'm a dog, you come with sticks, and the Philistine cursed David by his God. Come here, he said, and I'll give you flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Next one. So this is a friend of mine. He's a Portland police officer. This right here is an ACL pin, if you can see it, it's a little hazy here, that I have in both my knees, and somehow my doctor failed to mention what can happen. So the next slide. So this is what happens, ACL pin right here. This is what happens when you're chasing a suspect after a stolen car chase, and the suspect turns on you as you're jumping over a 4-foot wall to follow him. Suspect turned as he's jumping, his leg got hit on the wall somehow and shattered his leg. Just completely shattered. You can see all the different breaks in the bone if it was more clear. And to the end of his life, this officer will have significant pain in that leg to deal with. And the best part of the story, I was talking to him, and he loves being a police officer. He loves taking care of the community. He enjoys that, of trying to keep our community safe. And in the hospital, his doctor, in typical doctor fashion, said, yeah, you don't really come back from this kind of injury. The best you can hope for is walking with a cane. You're done as a cop. And told him that in the hospital, right after surgery. So he told him that in front of his bosses, which is also one of those things that you don't want to hear in front of your bosses. So then, a few months later, I texted him, and I'm seeing how he's doing, and it was about 4 or 5 months later, and he goes, hey, I'm back to full duty. I was like, what? So then I just talked to him a couple weeks ago, and he just passed Portland's certification for canine officer, which is the equivalent of being like a triathlete. I mean, you have to be in incredible shape. It's long distance running. Canine officers suffer about 75% lost time injury rate per year. It's such an arduous. You're chasing a dog, as dogs go under stuff, and you're running into the thing that they went under. And it's just a tough. But Mike is now certified as a Portland canine, and he's waiting for an opportunity to be a canine officer. And that to me is that's that picture of a warrior. See, one of the things that happens is when you realize being a warrior, it takes its toll on you. It tears you apart physically, it tears you apart spiritually, emotionally, and it takes that toll on you. So don't enter, when you enter this process, you don't enter it lightly. But it's so crucial, so crucial. Next slide, please. So, back to our conflict. So David says to Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver me into your hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give your carcass to the Philistines. So then he goes on, the Philistine moved closer to attack. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. That is somebody who is trained. That is somebody, you watch videos of shootings, and you watch how military or police officers are in shootings. They're moving, they're pushing their advantage on the people that they're going on. You watch pictures of gangsters shooting, and you hear, like, by my house in southeast Portland, there was a shooting of 30-some shots, and they're about 15, 20 feet across from each other. And they're going, shooting back and forth, and you're much more likely to get hit if you live in a house nearby than actually where they're aiming. And that's the difference. You see people that aren't trained, and you watch them. And so officers will watch. When you have people who have military or police training that are criminals, they'll see that and go, ooh, the way he was carrying that gun, the way he moved forward as he was shooting and pressing his advantage, those are things that are not normal conflict things. So David moves toward the battle and reaches his bag, takes a stone, and slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in his forehead. He fell face down on the ground. So most of my children's Bible story books, they miss this part and it bugs me. But I understand why. They probably don't want to tell it. But is the next part. So David triumphed over him. He ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from his sheath. And after he killed him, he cut off his head with his sword. I had a friend of mine who was in Special Forces, and he said to me, he goes, do you know how bad severed heads smell? And I was like, no, I don't. So I'm imagining you do. And that was that moment. He goes, this is not something that a little untrained boy did. This is somebody who had trained for this moment. And it says in the story as it continues that he carried the head of the Philistine through the battle all the way in. When Saul calls him forward, it says David was still carrying the head of Goliath. And that is a really interesting. Look at this conflict, and it is transformed. It's funny how, to me, in my life, in different ministry contexts, God has taken His Word and taken it and transformed it and changed it in my mind and understanding it. And now I've understood more about this idea of training to be a warrior. Next one, please. So we talked about the visceral response, coming from strong emotion, not from logic or reason. That's a natural response when we're in a crisis. Next one. David knew who he was and who he wasn't. Next one. He was courageous. He acted in courage. Okay. So I want you to do something now. I want you guys, if you can, I want you to stand up. So I'm going to play a video. This is a training that I was part of filming with Clackamas County. And so the scenario is a man has taken his family hostage, and he's holding his family hostage. So it's a training scenario. No actual people are killed. But I want you to see this. It's a simultaneous split screen of this incident. And the SWAT team from Clackamas is going in this house to take this man and stop him from killing his family and to neutralize him, to kill him. So what happens is all these things happen simultaneously. And I want you to think about this in the church. I want to think about the way that we learn to act in courage as warriors, and we become decisive and we work together as a community. Because too often we have people kind of doing warrior stuff, but they're all kind of battling each other. And it was really a great thing. My brother did the filming on this, and they put it together so that you can see exactly what's going on. There's a guy in a storage shed out back. There's people in the back of the house. There's people in the front with explosives, and then you have an entry team that comes in with the camera on them. So go ahead. Go ahead. This is the window of the room. This is the suspect holding him. This is the shooter.
Hey, slow down, give me status. Good, everybody, secondary. One is down. Everybody slow down. Miller, you're ready. What's going on?
So there's a line here you have to hear. Sorry, Mike. That's. So you stop it. So the person who is playing the suspect in this is the chaplain for Clackamas County, Mike Vermace, and so he says. So the guy takes him down to the ground and simulates shooting him, and afterwards he goes, "Sorry, Mike," and he goes, "No, if I was trying to do those kind of things to my family, I would want you to put a bullet in my temple." And this officer's kind of like going, "Oh, okay." And it's that part. It's those moments where that is that real kind of situation. That is those things. And I wish as a church we had that ability to tactically to think through processes and to train for opportunities that we have in our own communities to interact in conflict. And I think as we do, I think that is when God calls us into a special relationship like David had. And my prayer is that he can say that about us, that we are people after God's own heart. So let's close in prayer. God, we thank you that you call us. And you don't call us haphazardly. You don't call us without equipping us. Pray you give us strength and courage to deal with our failures and keep moving forward. And I pray you would bless these people and help them to be courageous in their homes, in their churches, and their communities. Praise in your name. Amen.